Welcome everybody. That is our third episode of our digital discussion series on Syria. My name is Thomas Müller-Faber. I'm the head of the International Affairs Program of the Protestant Academy in Locum. That is a church-run dialogue platform here in northern Germany. And normally we do face-to-face conferences and track two formats, but in these unusual times even we are digital. In our last two episodes, we talked about the war and the external powers. And today we would like to focus more on the humanitarian crisis within Syria and among Syrians living in the neighboring countries of the region. And it's a great pleasure for me to moderate, but it's more so a pleasure to have two wonderful experts with us today. On the one hand, we have Jomana Kapoor. Jomana Kapoor is a non-resident senior fellow with the Rafiki Hariri Center in Middle East and Middle East program of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., where she is the head of the Syria portfolio. And Jomana is currently also member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee, as a part of the civil society group. And she's also co-founder of an humanitarian aid organization which primarily works in the northwest of Syria and which has the name Syria Relief and Development. And there's more to tell about her, but maybe I end her CV with that. She's also the chairwoman of the American Relief Coalition for Syria. That's an umbrella organization of 10 Syrian American humanitarian aid organizations. And so you see, she has quite some experience, in particular in the humanitarian side, but also on the political side, and the negotiation side. And we are absolutely delighted that Jomana is with us today. Then we have with us Nadim Houri. He is the executive director of a think tank based in Paris, which is called the Arab Reform Initiative. He is, before he joined the Arab Reform Initiative, he was with Human Rights Watch and worked there for more than 10 years. And he was the head of the Human Rights Watch office in Beirut for more than a decade, where he focused on terrorism, counterterrorism, and oversaw in that function also a lot of work in Syria and other Middle and East and North African countries. So he's also quite experienced in that field. By training, he's a lawyer and brings on in that perspective as well. So absolutely a great asset to our discussion, and we are very much pleased that Nadim is with us today. And also a warm welcome to all you participants out there. It's Friday afternoon. That's always a difficult time for having a discussion format, but it's great that so many are there and still eager to learn more about Syria. That's absolutely great. And we will now have a moderated talk of 30 to 40 minutes. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A session where participants have the chance to bring in their thoughts, their questions, their comments, either by the Q&A function, which you find at this lower field of your screen, or the chat function as well. So normally we get a lot of questions. I try to cluster them a bit, but we will see how that goes. And with that, I would like to start the discussion by asking the first question, which I like to address to Jomana. How is the humanitarian situation within Syria and among the Syrians living in neighboring countries? Can you draw us a picture about the general situation?
First of all, Thomas, thank you very much for having us, and thank you to the university for hosting what I think is always a timely discussion. Unfortunately, it has been always timely to talk about the humanitarian conditions in Syria for the last 10 years, given that they have not improved, and they remain a critical part of what prevents Syria from moving forward. positively. So just to give you an idea, I'll try to cover both inside of Syria and like you said, the neighboring countries. I'll start off more generally in the government-held areas of Syria, which now includes, I would say between 60 to 70% of Syria. Even before I get into Caesar, which I know is something, Thomas, you and I briefly mentioned, and I know will be brought up during this discussion. So even before June 17th, before Caesar went into effect, you had a very grim picture. The World Bank and others have already, estimated that Syria's physical destruction is about, is in excess of $400 billion, or would require more than $400 billion to repair. You had already COVID, which I'll get into in a bit, that had exacerbated the conditions. You also have the fact that many of Syria's allies, including Iran, have also been under sanctions and are more cash-strapped than before in terms of being able to, or being willing to provide Syria with some of the necessary aid needed. And of course, as we see the picture in Lebanon, which I hope to even hear more about from Nadim, is in a very dire situation independently, anyway, and separate from Syria. The Syrian lira today hovers around 3,000 liras to the dollar. And just to put that in perspective, prior to 2011, the lira was around 50. So it's dropped dramatically. The average salary is probably between $20 and $40 a month. And Syria is simply just not an economy that can exist, or operate via the internet. Most jobs are not remote. And so the lockdown that was instituted briefly by the Syrian authorities, which is now slowly being undone, as many other countries in the region, they have allowed or permitted government bureaucrats, soldiers, mukhabarat, etc., to really create new opportunities for their own personal and financial benefit. Shop owners who want to keep their businesses open beyond the curfews that Syria imposed have to pay bribes to policemen, and those who are arrested for violating the curfews are oftentimes asked to pay huge sums of money in order to be released. In some cases, after undergoing torture. Residents that are in rural areas that may be participating in the agricultural sector are having to pay huge amounts of money in order to pass through to other governorates for their businesses, which in turn obviously makes the produce or the vegetables or whatever it is that they're selling even more expensive in order for the seller to make up for that cost. Across regime-held areas, you have checkpoints that are manned by all kinds of militias that extort taxes from traders that are transporting goods, sometimes even stopping people who are passing by and demanding such payments to make up for the fact that they themselves are not being paid enough by the Syrian government. You have the very real fear of agricultural deficiencies. It's not just something that is theoretical. We've heard recently several economic experts and otherwise commenting on the fact that there might be a looming famine in Syria beginning of next year if this isn't addressed. Specifically, I would say this is the situation in Idlib. And there has been very real signals of rising hunger in Idlib for several months now, even before we saw the currency collapse. To that end, that any, and I'll get into this a bit later, but because Idlib functions primarily on humanitarian aid, halting or decreasing that amount of aid would be lethal, because it basically sustains 70% of the population in Idlib right now. You have the facilitation of energy sources, which just recently, the Syrian energy sector has been under different layers of sanctions, but now during Caesar, that's been even more formalized. And as we go into a cold winter, Syrians, this really impacts the ability of Syrians to be able to access enough heat to heat their homes, etc. I'll just talk briefly about Lebanon and Jordan. 78% of refugees in Jordan, and 73% of those in Lebanon live under the poverty line, and are sustained almost purely by humanitarian assistance. We know Lebanon hosts about 1.5 million Syrians, and they have been subjected to a series of different harassment measures, detention. I think everyone heard the story of the young Syrian boy who was sexually harassed, and it was captured on video, by Lebanese. We also have the example last year in June of the Syrian camps that were burned in Deir al-Ahmar. And there are also special curfews that only apply to Syrians in Lebanese villages. There are several other, administrative hurdles that refugees both in Lebanon and Syria have to, that are, specially tailored, unfortunately for them. In Lebanon, refugees are not permitted to start a business without legal residency. And without going into too much detail, you can imagine how difficult it is for any Syrian to have formal legal residency and constantly, updating or renewing that residency. So that forces most businesses to remain largely informal, without protection, and most of the time, operating in black market as opposed to any formal markets. And in terms of Jordan, I will say that, it's a bit mixed there. I was really happy to see the Jordanian government, I believe this week, finally opened up this number sectors that Syrians are allowed to work in. For a long time, this was a very big problem. My organization, my humanitarian organization, we have offices in Jordan, and Syrian doctors couldn't work formally, and many other Syrian professionals couldn't. And so by opening that, you have finally allowed Syrian refugees to work in a formal legal manner and be able to support their families. And I think there are definitely positive trickling effects that can come of this. But there are still some other hurdles in Jordan. You have, Syrian refugees are given permission to start home-based businesses, but very few of them have registered because you need a valid passport, for example. And 95% of Syrians in Jordan don't have access to a valid passport. And then, in terms of businesses outside of the home, Syrians are required to have a Jordanian partner in order to establish those. So there's still very real hurdles in Jordan, but I would say that it's a bit improved. I mean, Lebanon is going through its own independent meltdown, and so that only worsens conditions for the Syrians there. And I'll leave sort of talking about I wanted to mention about the UN and humanitarian aid, but I know you're going to ask me about that, so I'll hold on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Before I give the word to Nadim, maybe there was already a question, an informative question, and you mentioned the exchange rate, a number, and the average salary. Could you?
Sure, the exchange rate right now hovers around 3,000. I mean, it actually depends on. So, for example, if you send through Western Union, the formal rate, I think, is about 700, 800 liras per dollar. So if you do it through the formal means, you get less liras for your dollar. But if you go through informal means, the dollar is about 3,000 liras, more or less, fluctuate, obviously. And the average salary, I mean, it hovers between $20 and $40.
I see, okay. So, Nadim, is there something you would like to add to this dimension, humanitarian crisis in Syria, to this general drawing picture overview?
Yeah, maybe just, no, I agree with everything that Jumana said. I would just also add, it's now year 10 almost, right? So it's no longer just a humanitarian crisis. It's I don't know, a development crisis. It's a lost generations at this point. And I think it's important to we're no longer just talking about the importance of feeding or lodging people. I mean, we're losing generations. I think what is particularly important to sort of, and I think really challenging for us, is most of us who've been following Syria, and I think most of the Mashriq region has sort of assumed, okay, it's going to be a terrible war, it will stop, and then there will be peace, right? And then peace and people, and the Syrians are very entrepreneurial, there'll be funds coming in, they will rebuild it, they will go back, and the cycle goes on. And now we're actually in this weird phase, right? Because the war is clearly not over and bombs are still falling on Idlib, but the level of violence has decreased dramatically, right? And, you know, for all intents and purposes, and I would say from my perspective, unfortunately, Assad has come out on top with his allies, the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah. But so you know, he may have won the war, but he hasn't won the peace. So we're sort of in this in-between period, which now the risk is, and what worries me is it may end up staying with us for a long time.
Okay.
And it's harder to mobilize, first of all, international aid when you're in this in-between period, even though, you know, if you talk to most Syrians, they would tell you the economic harm right now with over the last year is probably more than what they've lived before. Because again, before you had the war economy, and anyone who's lived through a war will tell you in the war economy, there's money flowing in because people are buying weapons, salaries for the militiamen, and so forth. But you're neither in a war economy nor in a peace economy. You've got the sanctions. There's also a global recession. And actually the Mashriq region, you know, so Syria and Lebanon, are in the middle of a generational meltdown. I mean, I don't think we can actually overstate the crisis of what is happening. And, you know, the statistics from Lebanon, I mean, already for the Syrian refugees were terrible. When, you know, we've been looking at the statistics for Lebanon for the Lebanese now, and they are actually terrible. So, you know, as you know, the whole thing is sinking. And there's very little policies being put in place to basically redress the ship. And I think this is really what's challenging. And no one is even talking about reconstruction now. It was already unlikely before, and now sort of, I think you know, it was clear that Syria's, the regime's allies were not going to foot the bill. No money was going to be flowing in. And I think now as well with the Caesar Act, it's become clear that, you know, funding for reconstruction is not going to happen. So the big question is, you know, what do we call this? Because it's when the crisis is going to go on for a long time. I don't know if we should keep calling it a crisis.
Crisis, yeah, indeed, yeah. Many people here in Germany and maybe in other parts of Europe now ask themselves if will there be a second refugee wave like in 2015? If you see the very severe situation in Syria and the neighboring countries, what's your feeling? Will this happen again, or is it rather a thing that was 2015 and not going to repeat? Maybe both of you.
Do you want to start? Or?
No, you go ahead.
I mean, could there be another waves of refugees? Yes. I mean, but they're not just going to be Syrians. They may be Syrian, Lebanese, with Palestinians living in Lebanon, perhaps with Iraqis, if the situation keeps on going. I mean, I think I don't want to sound too dramatic, but I do think the Mashriq, you know, when you look at I mean, the economy in Syria is way worse than it was at the worst moments of the conflict. So, you know, I mean, when you hear the numbers that Jumana was giving, most people are not being able to buy enough food. So maybe the bombs are falling less. And at some point, I think they will try to seek an alternative answer. Now, the problem is the neighboring countries are no longer safe spaces. I mean, again, actually now, I mean, I've spoken to some Syrians in Lebanon in recent months. They're going back to Syria because at least there they could have the basics to continue surviving, which they no longer find in Lebanon. Turkey has become a very hostile place for Syrians in recent years, and Jordan is barely surviving. So could we start seeing new waves? Possibly. You know, I think, but what form it will take and so forth, I don't know. But it's clearly the situation is not sustainable. At least that's my take.
I would just add to what Nadim's saying. I mean, I think brain drain from the region has been happening anyway for an extended period of time. You know, I think that there are people who are leaving Syria now that have no, for example, they might not have any political differences or care to share them with the regime and would have otherwise be able to remain and have chosen not to because there's really, I mean, there are no jobs. The situation in Lebanon, as Nadim was saying, you have, no one wants to be Syrian in Lebanon right now, right? Like the worst thing you could be is a Syrian in Lebanon. I think they are also, some politicians are using them as a scapegoat to escape, the ear of their own population, given their own, massive corruption and governance difficulties in Lebanon. So, and I think the region at large, whether it's Egypt or, the Gulf is not, many countries in the Gulf are now cutting, I think it was Kuwait recently, it cut all the expat jobs in Kuwait by either a third or a half. Don't quote me, it's been a couple of weeks since I read this, but the point is this is a trend we've been seeing in the Gulf. Part of that has to do with the oil prices that are decreasing, but they are no longer, sort of that, the readily available sort of opportunity that many people from the Levant and North Africa used to go, turn to in order to earn money, remittances, and send them back home. So the entire region, I think, is struggling to propose sustainable job, economic opportunities for its youth. And until it figures that out, I think we're going to continue to see these trends.
Okay, I see.
And I think it's important to pick on Jumana's point about the brain drain from the region, because I think I suspect the immediate next wave, and they're not going to be refugees coming on boat in terms of the next wave. I think the immediate next wave is going to be the educated middle class, which may have survived the war in Syria or which stayed in Lebanon, and now they're making the decisions to leave, and they'll come on planes with tickets, but it will be a huge loss for the region. I think we might see massive numbers of people leaving, and I think this is there's a real tragedy, and I think people in Europe need to be aware that I think there's a general disengagement, perhaps less in Germany than other parts of Europe, but the rest of Europe is disengaged from the region. But you're looking at a series of countries that already pre-COVID-19 were barely institutionally, making it and functioning. And I think between what's been going on, you may be looking at a series of failed states on your immediate vicinity. And I think that no one is really grappling with this right now.
I see. Okay. So maybe I would like to ask you again, Nadim, as we almost near 10 years of conflict, what has been the impact of the conflict and the massive displacement you just talked about on the Syrian society? Is there still something like a Syrian society? Is there some links that brings Syrians together, some social glue, or is it all like a mosaic, very broken? How's so a very broad and general question? And Jumana, you're happy to join in.
Yeah, Jumana, ask a friend for help. It's a difficult question. I mean, there's no doubt a conflict with the violence that has taken place in Syria over the number of years. Half the population displaced, 6.2 million internally displaced, over 5 million refugees. But I think numbers don't actually, there are communities that have been completely wiped out. Cities like Raqqa, which have been just completely upended. Even socially, demographically, neighborhoods have changed completely. Even areas that may not have seen as much war completely changed, have been affected. Now, how do you measure this? How can you measure this? And I guess in social sciences, there were some attempts to capture some of that in the form of a social capital index. And I'm aware of only one study, I think in Syria, done in 2017, looking at things like trust between citizens and authorities, levels of participation. And even back then, which was done in a small sample, I think the study was published in 2017, but it was about 2014, 15, was already a 30% drop. The numbers are probably going to be much higher now. Now, that doesn't mean that Syrian society doesn't exist anymore. Of course it does. I think there are many things. I mean, it's been very interesting to see some communities continue to live on virtually. So for instance, even when I was doing some research on Syria, and you would have residents from one particular village that have gathered themselves in exile on a closed Facebook group, you know, and you might have 3 people in Turkey, 2 in Germany, 1 in the Netherlands, you know, 2 in the US, and they somehow keep their communication that way. In countries, in cities like in Germany, where there's a big Syrian concentration, we're seeing new forms of mobilization. So on the one hand, clearly, yes, this has fragmented Syria. It has the level of lack of trust. And I would say there is even if there is peace tomorrow, I don't know if there's an agreement on what tomorrow Syria looks like. And in part because, you know, the regime is stuck in Arabic, where they say Syria al-Assad, you know, Assad Syria. I mean, literally, this is the slogan, right? This is the, and that for the regime, these symbols and that imagery has not changed at all. It's still the same narrative, right? And everything is caused by foreign conspiracy and this, and for these, you know, millions and millions and millions of Syrians who have suffered, who've been displaced, this is Syria al-Assad is almost an occupying country in the way they relate to it and to its symbols, so yeah, I think that there's a deep fragmentation, but also one has to remember that Syria has a very rich culture and a complex culture with layers of understandings and so forth. And you still see elements of that. The short answer is, I don't know how much of that social cohesion has been affected. Clearly a lot. And I think it depends from region to region. You know, I've been visiting Raqqa, for instance, since ISIS fell, and people who live there would tell you, we don't recognize our city. It's not our city. I mean, and actually most people who live in neighborhoods now are not the original inhabitants of Raqqa. So it would look like something else. I think something similar is happening in Deir ez-Zor as well in certain areas. I haven't been, recently I've not been allowed to go to regime-held areas to see what's going on. So I think a lot has been lost. But, I think the big question you ask is, what is the glue that's going to be? And, I think this is almost, it's what is the Syria that's going to come out on the other end of this process. That remains to be seen. But I'd be very interested to hear actually Jumana's answer about that.
No, I mean, I think, I agree with what Nadim is saying. I think what a Syrian is going to be like, even if the international community and Syrians are able to address the question of Assad, I think who Syrians are and what Syria will stand for is completely not clear at all. And I can tell you from our constitutional committee sort of discussions that we've had at least among some, we call ourselves the independent civil society members, because some of them are sort of, they're really just because they're appointed by the regime, and then some of us are sort of appointed or located across the world. And I think we have very different views, to be frank, on what Syria is. Or what Syria should look like in the future. I mean, there are people who have been communists for decades that see, Syrian revival looking like sort of a new experiment in communist or socialist, values. You have some religious, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but other religious elements. We've seen them pop up throughout the war, who want to impose a more Sunni identity for Syria. You do have secular, I think, Syrians, especially among the younger generation, but most of them a lot of them have left Syria and are perhaps exploring these ideas from outside of Syria. So how likely are they to go back to Syria and do this? I mean, we know from the Afghanistan example that 75% of Afghans never actually went back to Afghanistan after the war ended. So those living inside of Syria, it's not very clear what kind of Syria they want to see in the future. And that's going to have massive impact on the kinds of laws that are going to be, if there is room for, modification of law. And that's, nothing to say of the Constitution, which should, enshrine some kind of united identity and values that represent the Syrian people. And I think even at the basic level, Syrian people are not united in their vision of Syria for the future. And that's an issue, sadly, that only Syrians can address. I mean, it can be imposed on them. It won't be organic. It won't have sort of reverberations at the grassroots level. So you'll have a different problem on your hands. But until Syrians can come up with a consensus, and there are different initiatives. I'm not saying that this hasn't been addressed or it's not on anyone's radar. There are certain initiatives run by, I know, Bassel Cardo in Paris, well, he's in Beirut right now, but I know that there are several, well-known Syrian experts and scholars who are trying to focus on this issue. But I mean, only the future will can tell, what way this will go.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I would like to come more back again to the question of humanitarian situation, and in particular on humanitarian aid. Because we had early this week, a larger conference convened by the European Union and United Nations here in Brussels. And it was, I think, for the fourth time, a conference that brought together, in particular, decision makers from many countries with the focus on improving humanitarian efforts in Syria and for Syrians. And against that background, I would like to ask you, Jumana, is the humanitarian aid system currently in place in Syria doing its job, or how would you tweak it if you could? So maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. And there were at least 3 questions which went into the same direction. Maybe we can funnel them in. Well, please, first you, Jumana.
Sure. So no, of course, I mean, we've been following very closely the developments on the, UN Security Council resolution that technically expires July 10th. We had a very similar struggle with the Russians in January when, the cross-border resolution was also up for renewal. It ended up being, by Russian and Chinese, the Russians and Chinese ended up forcing 2 of the border crossings to be closed. One very important one, Yaroubiya, which was the primary UN crossing from Iraq into northeast Syria, leaving us with only 2 border crossings, Bab al-Hawa and Bab al-Salam in Idlib. And remember now, in both northeast Syria and northwest Syria, you have 4 million people in each area, by the way. So when you closed Yaroubiya, you put really 4 million people's lives in jeopardy, which we have seen play out absolutely in the past several months due to COVID. The responsibility, when Yaroubiya was closed, the responsibility was supposed to fall back on UN Damascus to provide COVID aid. That aid was heavily directed by Damascus, by the Assad regime. Any aid that eventually trickled up to northeast Syria was going only to regime, affiliated clinics and individuals and institutions that were closely affiliated with the regime. The SDF, the Autonomous Administration, they lodged many complaints about this. You saw the first instances of COVID actually, they were announced in northeast Syria. And I think what we've seen really play out in northeast Syria is that if we give Damascus full control over humanitarian aid through the UN, Damascus is going to be basically instrumentalizing this aid for its own political purposes, depriving people that don't agree with it from aid and rewarding those that do, or the cronies that continue to support its systems. Now, looking at Idlib, you have 2 crossings, and what we've heard so far from the Russians is that they only plan to keep one open for 6 months. And so that's basically, you're talking about all the UN's work going to have to be done out of Damascus except through one border crossing. And currently, right now, the only way people in Idlib have access to aid is through those 2 border crossings through Turkey. They are vital. Without them, you're really putting 4 million, and I'm sure you saw what happened earlier this year, or from the end of last year, rather, until March, till the détente between the Russians and the Turks. But 1 million Syrians were displaced in a matter of 3 months, I believe. It was the largest displacement. I mean, if Syria was already bad, but to see the largest displacement only happen now, it was really shocking to watch. And you put one in the dead of winter. You had hundreds of thousands of Syrians living in open air situations, on blankets, with little access to water, and those conditions have continued. You have, I mean, during COVID, right, the minimum you need to do is wash your hands. People don't have access to enough water, or enough, locations where they can even, practice good hygiene. Women are always at risk every time they need to access these kinds of places. So, when you talk about, constantly washing your hands, we sometimes forget that even that simple act is impossible, next to impossible for people in Idlib. And so, that's, you have this backdrop, and you have Russia and China, and we're also worried about some other members of the UN Security Council, Vietnam, St. Vincent, who may be swayed by the Russians to force all aid to go through Damascus. And despite the fact that the United States government pledged in Brussels, as you said, 696 million, which has been the largest aid package by the United States so far, if your hands are tied and you can't get that aid to actually the people who need it, then it really, it's almost, fruitless to think about it in those terms. And what really worries me is, the Russians, they are really looking to make this a cross-line game as opposed to a cross-border aid. They want Damascus to have full control over the aid. The US is the largest donor to the United Nations in Damascus, Europe being close second. The United States has donated over $18.5 billion to the UN through Damascus. I think the Europeans about 11 billion. But the point is that money is really spent largely under the whim of the Assad regime. And several analysts have written, in very detailed terms about this. Hayed's report at Chatham House, I would encourage folks to look that report up, where he went through details about how the Syrian regime prevents any INGOs or the UN from being able to get visas for foreigners. It prevents monitoring of where the aid is being spent. It forces the UN and INGOs to procure from people who are close to it. I mean, what's very problematic, and which I don't think anyone in the international community has had an answer to yet, is that Syria Trust is Asma al-Assad's own personal charity. It is not, at least according so far to the State Department, it does not fall under Caesar sanctions because it's technically a humanitarian organization, but it's an organization that procures all its supplies from people close to the regime, that distributes aid, for example, in a way that increases sectarianism in Homs. I wrote about this for Carnegie recently, about how the UNDP is being instructed to build, Christian parts of the city that are close to the Sunni parts of the city, in order for Sunnis, increasing, resentment between the two populations, because the regime is not trying to build, it's not trying to bring people back to Syria and build, a united community by any means. It capitalizes on division. And so long as people are divided, they cannot unite back against the regime. And so using that aid, this is like the modus operandi of the regime. And we should expect that this will only continue.
Maybe that's a good point to get one of the questions that one of the participants asked. At that point, maybe I give it to you, Nadim. And it goes like this. The question is, what's the long run plan by the regime if the aid is funneled all through Damascus? So what's the idea behind it? Is there any plan for the country? The person who wrote the question: starve everyone in rebel-held areas or force them to leave? Or punish them? What's the long-run plan if the aid goes all through Damascus? Maybe can you, Nadim, elaborate on this?
I can give you my theory of what's in the strategy of the regime, and I think they've actually, they get A for consistency over the last few years. Their plan is to win at all costs. Those that they don't like, they will be more than happy to see them permanently displaced to neighboring countries or elsewhere. They have used again, none of this is new, right? The regime has used aid as a weapon in how it imposed sieges, how it rewarded those who stayed loyal to it, how it punished certain communities. And the more it can control this aid fully, the more it can impose its will, and it can impose its will from its perspective at a lower cost for its own fighters, right? So I think it's the strategy of the regime, and they haven't been hiding it, is they want to retake all of Syria and not have to negotiate or make any concessions. And even, I mean, you know, you can say, oh, Idlib is complicated, you've got some jihadi groups there and so forth, but even in the northeast of Syria, where there it's, you know, the Kurdish-led local administration, there's actually been very little blood between them and the regime, right? And Russia was proposing to sort of mediate. The regime was not interested in any negotiation. So the regime wants to go back to Syria al-Assad like it was before. Nothing changed. And if you hear their discourse, they have not, you know, shifted an iota. So it's for them, it's continuing. You know, the challenge they have right now is they don't have the manpower to retake these. Without the assistance of the Russians and the Iranians, it's a challenge for them. So it becomes important to control aid to do this. I mean, no one is losing sleep on the regime side in Damascus if people die of hunger in Idlib. They literally don't care. You know, even on the COVID-19 case, you know, the case that Jumana was talking about, the first case that was publicly recognized in the northeast of Syria, supposedly, according to the Kurdish local administration, the test was done in Damascus, but no one bothered to send the results back. So the person was not even known to have had COVID-19 for a few days. So again, I think it's a very cynical game that the regime is willing to play. It has international backing through its allies, and the West is increasingly disengaged from it, because I think again, for the Europeans, you know, again, I'm going to be very cynical and blunt. They've paid Erdogan to play the gendarme, to play the actual coast guard for Europe, and as long as the refugees don't arrive on European shores, there is no crisis in the European mindset. The US has decided to use sanctions as its main foreign policy tool. And anyone who's looked at the use of sanctions in the region say, well, this could go on for a decade or 2 decades. Again, maybe it won't change anything. And so all the key actors are happy to wait. Turkey is happy to wait as well. It has its enclave, it's building it up. It's including, you know, it's training police to actually even rename the police. Some of the police stations in northern Syria now are spelled police, P-O-L-I-S, like in Turkish. They're recreating local councils that are dependent. So all the regional international actors at this point don't feel much of a sense of urgency. It's only, you know, Syrians who care about Syria and Syrians on the ground who realize the free fall that the country is in.
Okay, I see. Maybe that's also, since you mentioned Turkey, because another question came in, and I would like to take this and then move on with our moderated discussion. One person asked, what is the situation of Syrian refugees in Turkey and in the Turkish-controlled regions of Syria? Maybe, Jumana, you can say a word.
I'm happy to take that question. So, you know, I mean, obviously, Turkey is home to the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world. You have about 6 million Syrians, both formal refugees and informal, that are there. And Turkey shares the largest border with Syria. So, you know, it has gotten involved, like Nadim said, for a whole host of reasons, including, you know, their own issues with the PKK affiliated groups, etc. So not necessarily for the sake of the Syrian people by any means. You know, the Syrian refugees inside of Turkey, there are mixed, they've had mixed experiences. Some of them have managed to sort of develop semi-stable lives, and many of them, I mean, I spent last summer in Turkey, you know, sort of trying to engage with a lot of these communities, and, you know, some of them now speak fluent Turkish. You know, they are predicting, you know, that they will likely live for the rest of their lives in Turkey. But there are definitely very real issues inside of Turkey, even for Syrian refugees. Before I get into Turkey's role inside of Syria, you know, last summer, for example, there was sort of a mass hysteria because Turkey was trying to relocate Syrians, literally picking them up out of the streets of Istanbul and throwing them into Idlib. And you had, I remember there were several well-known cases of like students who were enrolled in Turkish schools Turkish universities, and suddenly they were picked up because they didn't have their IDs on them. And they were transported back into Idlib, and one of them, his university got involved in Mother, and it was like it was a big deal on social media, and they eventually were returned back to Syria. But this is, so the situation inside of Turkey is not, it really is mixed, and I'm not going to paint an unnecessarily rosy picture. They've obviously had challenges. Now, in Turkish-held areas inside of Syria, my organization works in Afrin. We've been asked to build hospitals there, run hospitals.
North of Syria, right? It's a northern part of Syria.
In North Syria. And we've been asked to build, to run hospitals and provide medical care. But we have only been asked to provide medical care. And I say that because while in other parts of Syria, Idlib, North Aleppo, etc., you do have local councils that Nadim was talking about. But the role of civil society is non-existent in the areas that are run by the Turkish government. They do not see civil society as a partner. And this is something that we have actually, has been discussed with various Turkish officials that, first of all, you have the demographic changes that cannot be understated that have happened in areas held by the Turks. There's been a lot of mass displacement of people that, and sort of having, areas that were once Kurdish dominated, now dominated by Arabs, unfortunately. And this is an issue that I don't think is going to go away at all. It's going to have to be addressed. But unfortunately, civil society is not being given the space to look at this issue at all. The international community has so many other things that they're worried about in the Syrian context that looking at that question in particular is not being addressed. I mean, the one thing I'll say is that bombs are not dropping in Turkish-held areas in Syria, and that's because the Russians won't bomb them. Those are areas where there's obvious, as Nadim said, Turkish police presence, Turkish military presence, and they're not going to bomb those exact areas. So in terms of immediate survival needs, it does provide that for Syrian people. But there have been a series of actions that are taken, including the fact that local governance is not really local. It's very much tied to the Turkish state. And that will pose problems not only for Syrians who live there, but frankly for the Turkish government moving forward. It will be an issue.
Jamal, your picture is freezing. We can't hear you at the moment, but hopefully you're coming back soon. Maybe that's okay. Here we are.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I also heard. I had a question for Jemana because I heard in some areas, given the depreciation of the Syrian pound, some areas in Syria are now using the Turkish lira as the main currency.
Yeah. Well, so they've been using the Turkish lira for I think over a year now. Not necessarily everywhere. But yes, there were reports that this is becoming a more a normalized practice. Yeah, yes.
Okay. Maybe since we're running a bit out of time, we should now move. I would like to continue the moderation as for a long time. I had so many other questions, but maybe we should now start more to the question of the participants since there are more and more coming in. If you are fine with that, thank you very much so far. I have a question. If I press the button, can you see that or participant out there, or there's a question, otherwise I will read it to you. And to the participants, if you want to, there is also the chat function, which gives you the opportunity, if you write something there, everyone can see it. Otherwise, if you use the Q&A, it's only me and I think you, the panelists, who can see it. One question I have is, since we talked about Russia a minute ago, what is the role of Russia with respect to humanitarian action? Can you elaborate a bit on that? Jemana or Nadim, who feels addressed by the question?
Jemana probably knows the ins and outs better than me on that one.
I'm sorry, I was trying to read the question myself. Can you repeat that?
And what is the role of Russia with respect to humanitarian action?
I mean, I think I covered a bit about how it's been. I mean, Russia's using the United Nations basically to achieve things that it does not want to pay for and it can't pay for, and trying to, given that reconstruction is prohibited in Syria, by Caesar and by other previous laws, it is trying to find ways to restore or rehabilitate parts of Syria using using that UN aid, because it won't fit the bill itself. They certainly didn't have a problem helping destroy Syria, but now they don't want to pay for its restoration. They have no interest in that. So I think that's one of the main things the Russians are doing. They are providing some humanitarian aid themselves, but most of the NGOs affiliated with Russia are related to its Ministry of Defense, and are there really to achieve certain aims, sometimes on the coast, but really are there just to serve Assad regime, allies and all that.
I see. Okay. Another question that I have, I click it. Hopefully all participants can see it. That's a question addressing what will happen if Syrians refugees return to Syria. Will there be a conflict between those who return and those who remained in the country? Is there any fear, or how would you address that question? Maybe Nadim, you.
Well, I mean, so there have already been returns, right? And the main concern at this point is about the safety of the returnees, because particularly, young men are being drafted into the military. They may disappear. There may be arrests and so forth. Secondly, when they're going back, well, one, it depends on which areas they're going back to, and which areas they fled from, because that also affects how the regime is looking at them. But the security situation on the ground is very, very much controlled. So no, we don't foresee, at least I don't foresee immediately attention. Those who are coming back are going back exhausted. I mean, they're going back, they just want to have a roof to live under at this point. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we've seen any sort of local peace building in any meaningful manner. They're sort of going back almost in a sort of frozen area just to sort of live. They're trying to keep their head down just to stay alive. Often because those who have gone back so far have just gone back because things have become so dire for them in Lebanon, or they've been pushed out of Turkey or out of Jordan. So I would not necessarily say it's a sustainable situation, also because there aren't jobs and so forth, and they have to, the regime is making it very hard to get certain forms of papers, and it takes a while, and the interaction with the security agencies is not great. And we're seeing, for instance, in some areas that protests are coming back. Smaller scale, much more focused on socioeconomic demands, but we've seen it in Dar'a. We've now also seen it in Suwaida, which has its own particular dynamics. It's mostly a Druze area, which had its own sort of dynamics during the conflict. So look, I think the main issue right now for the returnees is, can they return safely? That should be the main question on everyone's mind. And also, in addition to their physical safety, are they going to be able to go back and work for a living? I mean, if tomorrow, for instance, we start seeing that Lebanon becomes even harder, if the situation becomes even more impossible to live in for Syrian refugees, and they have to choose basically between two terrible situations, and they start going back to Syria, then they're going back to what? And will the regime allow them to gather and so forth?
Well, I would just add to that you have massive violations of housing, land, and property rights that Syria is going to struggle with. I mean, this is something you see oftentimes after civil wars. I know Bosnia, Yugoslavia, and the Balkans War grappled with this. But in Syria, you have, even if they're not allowed, or they're allowed to return, they make it through some checkpoints. And even then, by the way, it's been widely documented, as Nadim said, that even after Syrians have been given assurances, no, you can come back, you're not wanted, et cetera, that oftentimes they're being picked up anyways and arrested. And sometimes that's to collect, massive, bribes or bail money, or sometimes just because they're like, well, you've been in, let's say Turkey for 6 years, we can't guarantee that you're not going to cause problems for us, so we're going to have you arrested. But even if they are allowed, even if they make it through Syria's borders, many of them cannot return home. I mean, you have Hezbollah and Iran also who have made, I mean, it has been a targeted campaign of ensuring that, that demographic changes happen and that demographic changes are solidified in their favor, in order to make sure that, you know, the, you know, rebellious parts of Syria don't return. I mean, Ghouta is another example of that, where you're seeing, you know, other people being welcomed into homes, and it's not just happening by chance. This is a, you know, a deliberate, systematic campaign by the Assad regime and its allies.
I see. Okay, and maybe another question fits very well to what you said, because you already addressed it somehow. Another person is asking, we always refer to Syrians as one country, one society that suffers from war. Is it possible to unpack it a little and elaborate on what groups were affected differently during the conflict? Is there a major line you can draw? How would you answer this question?
How much time do we have?
Yeah. Maybe just a couple of, because it's complicated, I know, very complicated.
You know, it is a very complicated meeting, and you have different forms of victimhood, and you know, so I don't have an easy answer, frankly. I don't have an easy answer. I think we also need to resist this sense of the demography of Syria has changed in many ways. You know, people even still talk about sometimes the coast as being mostly Alawite. If you go to a city like Tartus or Latakia, there have been so many displaced from Aleppo who are Sunni. It's actually now probably a Sunni majority city. It has sort of changed. It doesn't mean that politically it has changed. So yes, we have to have a granular reading. I think even if you were living in Damascus, you know, you can be a Sunni living in Damascus. If you lived in Douma, you would have had an experience. If you lived, you know, in Malikiya or somewhere else, you would have had a very different experience. So I don't have an easy answer in 2 sentences. Maybe I might have a quicker take on it, but I don't have a way of formulating easily the impact.
So I'll address this question, and I think I saw a question on Syria's Christian minorities, and I'll kind of group that in, because in my former post before the Atlantic Council, I was working for the U.S. government and my portfolio was on religious minorities, and in Syria and in the region, but in Syria in particular. And I think the really unfortunate situation, and we see this used again, you know. This is the case for many minorities in the Arab world, is that they are often having to make pacts with those in power in order simply just to survive. The Syrian Christian community is obviously diverse. Some of them genuinely like the Sunni community. I mean, Asma al-Assad is Sunni. This is not just a Alawi issue, right? Like, Syrians are not divided. In my own family, we have, you know, the Humsi side is different than the Shami side, the Damascene side, and they have different opinions on the conflict. And I certainly think it's lazy and intellectually dishonest to say that, you know, all Christians are pro-Assad and all Sunnis are anti-Assad. That's just not the case. But especially with Syria's Christian minorities, you also have the Ismailis and Hama. Anytime any of their leaders, and we also saw this in Sweda. So anytime you've seen their leaders try to push back, they might be religious leaders or otherwise, and oftentimes it actually has been some of their religious leaders who have voiced even some concern about the actions of the regime. That leader has been kidnapped, attacked, disappeared, killed. I mean, and they're able, you know, basically paralyzing the entire community, silencing the entire community. And you see a mass effort by the community itself to keep order within the ranks, because they don't want the entire community to be subjected to mass attacks. And a lot of times, I mean, you know, I'm making some generalizations because yes, you know, in the Middle East, you do find places where you might find more Christians than others, right? You have neighborhoods like, you know, where you might find more Christians, or certain governorates where you find more Ismailis or Druze, and so even even the geography works against a lot of these minorities because they might happen to live close to each other. And so, for example, I'll give you two examples. With the Ismailis in Hammam, you had when ISIS was doing attacks on them, there were reports that the regime deliberately left them unprotected because it wanted that minority group to come back basically and to see that they had to be under the mercy of the Assad regime if they were going to be saved. The Assad regime could have prevented that massacre, and it deliberately chose not to. You had a different example in Sweda, Syria's, it's a largely Druze governorate. It does have non-Druze in there, but it is largely a Druze governorate. And because they're sort of in their own, defined, enclave, they were able to push back on the regime enough to say, listen, our boys will serve in the army, but they will only protect our area. You're not going to send them off to Aleppo or to Hama or to Idlib to fight your wars. This is what we're doing, and we're going to, that's how we're going to ensure our own protection. And you're seeing now, that they're also this new wave of, hunger protests. They're actually asking for the fall of the regime, which is almost shocking after 10 years and given what you've seen in Syria. But all of this, and I know several Syrian Christian leaders, especially in northeast Syria, that were disappeared, Assyrian and Chaldeans, and they never were heard of again. Father Paulo is also, he's still missing, and so, they're certainly not a monolith. And I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of all the jihadi groups that have also equally targeted a lot of these minority enclaves to do the exact same thing, also using them to sort of get back at the regime, right? There was a point in time where you had 2 Shia villages that were completely encircled by the opposition-backed groups because they knew that by doing that they would put pressure on the regime. So both sides have unfortunately instrumentalized the torture, and war crimes against minorities to extract concessions from the other side.
Okay. Maybe since you mentioned the demonstration in southern Syria, there's another question which fits well since it addresses also what was discussed in our last episode. There was one expert, Mr. Gerlach, who said that there's still a chance that the regime could crumble and be toppled at any time. Would you agree with that? That's still out there, or is the power grip that strong that it's not an option or possibility? Maybe Nadim.
No, I mean, it depends what consists the posing of the regime. No, I think the regime is strong. I mean, in the sense that when it comes to the reign of terror and sort of physical threats to the regime, today, I think the regime, frankly, since summer 2013, it was no longer in physical threat as such. And in a way, my own reading, some people read that the fact that there are divisions now between Assad and Rami Makhlouf, it's a sign of weakness. I actually think Assad feels sufficiently confident now that he was able, and desperate for income, but that maybe him and other parts of the family feel sufficiently strong that the role of Rami Makhlouf is over. Now, that's on the strength. Where do I see that the regime is weak? I think the regime is weak is that it has been unable to project and to convince people that it has a vision for what a victory looks like for the regime. It's unable to I actually think it's a lack of imagination. Huh? They're unable to project anything else, so they just keep telling Syria al-Assad, just like the way it was. And it's clear that formula, you cannot rebuild any form of peace in Syria. First with the Syrians, but also with the international community. And I think this is where the regime is weak, in the sense that there might be a palace coup at some point, maybe not immediately, in a couple of years, where, and again, we're sort of theorizing here, but maybe I think that there might be a weakness where the Russians might determine, because they are the strongest actor at this point, maybe Assad has overstayed, we need a slightly different, thing to offer, or maybe the Iranians will compromise. So the weakness of the regime is that it, in the process, has become so dependent on its external allies. So it depends a bit on the whims of its external allies. For now, the external allies are sticking with it, and I don't see them changing the regime. But when you depend on external allies, suddenly particular individuals become less indispensable.
I see. Okay.
I'll just add to what Nadim said, that I think it's important to remember that Caesar sanctions they're less designed to force the regime into making concessions directly, because this regime, I mean, even, Envoy Peterson, before we started the Constitutional Committee, we had a discussion with him. And one of the things that he was trying to do was have, confidence building measures, because he knew Syrians had no faith in the UN's ability to, after several years of failure, they didn't believe in this process. They didn't believe in, the reason they went out to fight, or excuse me, the reason they rebelled against the Assad regime was not for the constitution. It was for their, dignity, liberty, etc. And then, eventually, now that's been kind of forced to be in the context of a constitutional committee. So I remember Envoy Peterson, in his attempt to make, to have some confidence building measures, he was trying to get the release of only children who are imprisoned under the Assad regime, children. And you have about, I think, 500 to 700 child prisoners. The regime wouldn't even budge on even a fraction of those child prisoners. Like, we know that this is not a regime that will give up an inch, even on these issues. But what the Caesar, and what I think the sanctions regime in general, rightfully or wrongfully, is trying to do, is try to force, as Nadim is saying, try to put pressure on actually Syria's allies, trying to put pressure on the Russians to be more pragmatic, trying to, I'm much more skeptical about the Iranians being more pragmatic about this, because I do think they're very much interested and invested in Assad himself, and they need that land bridge. I mean, these are all things that are, I think, important to the Iranians. But I think this is an attempt to, since Russia is really acting as the Assad regime's primary attorney, to try to get them to be more pragmatic and make some concessions, whether or not those are actually genuine substantive concessions, particularly concessions that touch on the security apparatus in Syria and the military. Everything else, I think, is almost superficial at this point. But if the security apparatus remains untouched in Syria, then you have not solved the Syrian conflict. You haven't actually solved the essence of the issues in Syria.
I see. Okay. Maybe we take one final question, because we're running out of time. Since you mentioned it already a couple of times, the Caesar Act, which is out now since, I think, 1 week or something in the US. And can you maybe elaborate a bit on that? What's the impact? What will be the impact of the Caesar Act? And what was the strategy and idea behind it? There was one question going in that direction. Maybe Nadim, you go first, and then Jumana, because I know that Jumana
started answering it in many ways by saying, it's. I'll try to keep you very brief. I think, yes, it's part of a general U.S. strategy of maximum, using sanctions and, frankly, economic pressure to somehow try to change the behavior of Iran and its allies in the region. We've seen over the last couple of years increasing sanctions on Iran, now on Syria, but also on Iran's allies in Lebanon. I agree with Jumana's take that really the signal, it's to open negotiations with the Russians and not necessarily with the regime. It's to gain some form of leverage. I think there is a real risk in the sanctions. The sanctions have humanitarian exemptions. The problem is, and we're already seeing that, but we've seen it in other sanctions, the way the humanitarian exemptions have been framed have been done in a way that doesn't give sufficient, I would say, comfort. So it's going to block a lot of people from being able to, so it will have an impact generally on the economy, and it will harm people. I think there's a real complex debate to be had about, reconciling, what I call the importance of pushing for accountability importance of holding people to account for all the crimes that happen in Syria, including through imposition of targeted sanctions, while also ensuring that sanctions don't end up making things worse. And how do you get that equilibrium? How do you get to that magical point? To me at least, is not yet clear. I suspect the Caesar sanctions will end up harming some Syrians, and there should be some things that be taken into account at this stage to minimize the impact of these sanctions on the general population. I don't see the US lifting them at this point. And I've had some friends argue that there are good reasons to keep them, but I think it's essential that there will be clearer carve-outs on the humanitarian exemptions and on things like allowing people to send money to their families and making it easier for bank transfers and so forth to minimize the impact on Syria. But I think it's an important debate to be had, and to be had in a thoughtful manner, not just in a sort of a shouting match.
Nadim, did a wonderful job of summarizing Caesar. The bill, just to give you a little bit of background, it's been, a bill that has been, sort of in the works for I think about 4 years now. This is something that that was not passed until this past December, but there were like 3 or 4 attempts to try to, attach this to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the law usually at the end of the year that a lot of other laws completely unrelated to defense are attached to get them through Congress simultaneously, get them passed by Congress simultaneously. It does have bipartisan consensus. And the sunset clause, the sunset on this law is 5 years. So the president doesn't have the authority or the ability to say, I'm not going to implement Caesar. He's required by law to do this. And he was on June 17th when the first wave of Caesar sanctions were announced. Actually, only 9 of the names that were announced were sanctioned under Caesar. The rest were sanctioned under other pre-existing laws and executive orders that sanctioned different Syrian individuals. For example, there's an executive order that sanctions anyone or the family of anyone who tries to obstruct the Geneva process. And that was really tailored to address anyone who might obstruct, for example, the Constitutional Committee and things like that. And so there are other different sanctions regimes that are available at the US to use. And so as Nadim was saying, and then the law also includes, specific mention of Russia and Iran and their support for the regime. And it basically codifies what 2254 says into American law, which is, it requires, that these laws, that these sanctions, if they're going to be removed before 5 years, they have to be, there has to be a political transition. There has to be, the fate of the detained and the missing needs to be addressed, no targeting of civilians, etc. I mean, the law is quite lengthy. It's almost 30 pages in length. And so there's a lot of substance in there, and it's meant to also deter any third party that wants to do business with the Syrian government to be warned. You have China who could be sanctioned. You have Gulf countries that do business with the Assad regime. It's also meant to ensure that there's no resumption of normal diplomatic relations. This is all codified in the law. And so it's really taking the things that the international community has theoretically talked about and put it into US law. Now, there is the issue of political will here. So even if Caesar sanctions, are imposed, Treasury can only work so fast to designate those people. You have to, the threshold, the legal threshold for putting people on sanctions is quite high. So you have to make sure that any challenge to being put on sanctions, being sanctioned can stand up within US courts. And so there could be ways that if a president doesn't want to apply this, that he could really slow the process down. He could, so it's in law, but there's some ways kind of to possibly slow down the implementation of the law. All this being said, I think what Nadim mentioned about the humanitarian exemptions is absolutely critical. It would be dishonest to say there won't be any impact on Syrian civilians. Although I do think that the US government has tried its best through this law to target individuals that we all know and we have come to know, like Asma al-Assad, of really fueling, our warlords, for lack of a better term. There are militias, Iranian-backed militias, that are also sanctioned under these laws. And these are not good actors. They are people who have committed war crimes and furthered, sectarian divisions in Syria, and have, done massive displacement of civilians. So I think what's incumbent upon civil society and humanitarian organizations right now is to now look at how Caesar is unfolding in Syria, right? Like, is to be evaluating and monitoring the impact of that law. If that includes, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, that if there's a massive problem with energy going into the winter, for example, does facilitating solar panels to Syrian civilians, can that help offset some of, because then you're at least providing energy without giving Assad, petroleum that he's using to bomb Idlib. Like, I mean, are there ways that we can bypass some of these restrictions? And I said, as I mentioned earlier, the agricultural sector is really in a dire situation. And, making sure that Syria doesn't starve, I think, is a responsibility, not only on civil society and humanitarian NGOs, but on the US government as well. And so, I think the real impact of Caesar is yet to be seen, but it's on us to follow up and see what that impact will be.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. We talked longer than we expected, half an hour longer than. So thank you very much to both of you, and it was a great pleasure. I learned a lot. We haven't unfortunately not answered all questions, but maybe I can write it to you via email, and maybe you can reply it in a written format if you find time. I know you're very busy. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants. There are more episodes coming up soon. There is one on the role of Europe in the Syrian conflict, which is held to be next week on Tuesday, together with Lina Khatib from Chatham House, with Salam Kawakibi from Paris, and with Muriel Azebuk from SWP. So 3 European countries, 3 perspectives on what Europe can do better on the Syrian crisis. And thank you again very much to Jomana and Nadim for joining us. And I wish you all the best, and have a nice evening or entire day, since it's around noon in DC. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.